Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. This is a joint presentation from the West Lincoln Public Library, the Welland Public Library, and the Pelham and Lincoln Public Libraries. So thank you for attending that. Just on behalf knowledge that Lincoln and unassociated people today. So, and I will introduce our guest speaker today. So it's Stephen Fraley. He is a photographer, writer, and educator. He is the founder and editor of the photography magazine Dear Dave and the author of Looking at Photography, a collection of essays published by Damien, and I will not say the last name because I will mispronounce it, in 2020. Fraley was the chair of the BFA Photography and Video program at SVA in New York from 1998 to 2018 and is now chair emeritus. He was the director of photography program at the Milton Avery Graduate School of Arts at Bard College from 1998 to 2004. He co-founded the graduate department in fashion photography at the School of Visual Arts in 2010 and the New York Fashion Film Festival in 2012. He founded the Auction for Photographic Education in Afghanistan to create photography department at Kabul University in 2003. He has received 2 MacDowell Colony Fellowships, a National Endowment for the Arts grant in photography, and an Aaron Skiskind Foundation grant. Portfolios of the work have appeared in Art Forum and the Paris Review. Fraley is the director of education at Red Hook Labs in Brooklyn from 2018 to 2020. He served on the board of trustees of the W. Eugene Smith Fund until 2021. He is currently the director of education at Photographic, probably wrong, in New York.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you now. For you to share and enlighten us. So thank you very much for joining us all the way from New York City.
Well, Lisa, thank you for having me. And I also want to thank Lorraine Drilling for initially extending the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you. The introduction, it sounds exhausting. All of those things that have occurred over the years, my goodness. I guess I'll start talking about the book and let me hold it up just for the purposes of a visual clue. As Lisa mentioned in her kind introduction, I've spent, in addition to being an artist and a photographer, I've spent a good part of my adult life working with artists and photographers in particular, working in visual arts education. And I've had the great privilege of involving myself with a medium that has changed enormously in the last 30 or 40 years. And it's been also my pleasure to have been in the classroom for that period of time and help to guide students to find their own relationship to the photographic medium, one that was of interest to them and relevant to them, and also to guide them and share with them all of the changes that the medium has gone through. Around 2016, I decided that I should probably start putting some of my thoughts on paper in terms of what I had learned about photography through the classroom and through the daily conversations about the medium. And by the way, I should add that what I do in terms of photographic education is not technological. It's not about, personally, it's not about making prints. It's not about the technology of the medium, but it's really about the photograph as a vehicle for information, and a photograph as an expressive idea, photograph as a form of storytelling, and again, helping to guide the students towards them coming to a relationship to photography that's meaningful to them. So again, I decided I should start putting some thoughts on paper, and in the process realized how much I had learned about photography through working with the students and through their inquiry and through their challenges. after a certain amount of time, I began to realize that to write a book about the medium in all its complexity would be rather daunting. So I decided to borrow the format of a classic of photographic writing, which was written in the 1970s by John Sarkowski, who for many years was the director, the curator of the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it was he who was very influential in terms of promoting the idea of photography as an art form and helping the public to understand its rich complexity. He wrote a book called Looking at Photographs, in which he chose 100 photographs from the collection of the Museum of Modern Art and wrote a page of text on each. So I decided that that would be a very helpful format for me to begin to corral my thoughts about the medium. So I chose 100 pictures that have been made since 1970 that I felt had been the most influential in the classroom. For one who knows about the medium and has followed the progression of thinking in photography, most of the photographers are fairly well known. And again, but in choosing the 100, I eliminated quite a few, which I'm particularly fond of their work, but who I don't feel, again, through my observations with the students, did a lot in terms of influencing how we thought about the medium. So I chose 100 photos. I wrote a page of text about each. I wanted to write a book also that was accessible to a broad audience, and that one could get something from the text without having to commit themselves to a lengthy tome. So Looking at Photography is a book that, again, you can pick up and read a page of text and look at a photograph and put it down. It doesn't take a lot of commitment, but again, something that was accessible, something that was user-friendly. I think something else which is probably notable about the book is that in general, photography has segregated itself among its many different functions. Generally, in terms of photographic connoisseurship, photographic practice, photographic education, fashion photography, for example, has a separate community than, say, photography, documentary photography, whose motive might be the photograph as a way to address problems in the world. I wanted to put all these different photographs together and treat them essentially the same. That's been something that I've been very assertive about in terms of developing a photographic education, feeling that all these different kinds of photography, and I think that's one of the richnesses, the resonances of photography, is the way that it connects to so many different activities and so many different trains of thoughts and so many motives in culture. Anyway, I wanted to produce a book which addressed all different genres, the diversity of photographic thinking without it being segregated. By the way, Lisa, if you have any questions as I go along, please jump in. I don't have anything strictly prepared. I don't have an agenda here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the book, so I'd be welcome for your questions. Let me do something here. I'm going to share the screen. Let's see if this works. Share. Okay. Hopefully you can see this. Again, this is the format of the book. By the way, the photographers are organized alphabetically, which to me reinforced the idea that I did not want to create hierarchies. I did not want to group the photographers into their, thematic similarities. I wanted to present the medium as being very diverse, perhaps fragmented, but as occupying many, many different aspects of creativity and fact and functions. Why don't I choose a couple of photographers that might be of interest? Could I get some indication that this is legible, that this can be seen on the screen? Lisa, can you?
Yeah, it's perfect. I can see it very well. And
Great.
yeah,
Thank you.
I think it's great. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, here's someone that I think might be writing the book. I wanted to, another thing that I did and that a number of people have commented on is that despite the fact that most of these photographers are known to the photographic community, I wanted to also choose photographs that were perhaps unusual for them or photographs that weren't as well known. I also chose particular photographs, I'll have to confess, which reinforced some of the ideas that I wanted to present in each page of text. One of the challenges in writing the text was to write to both, again, an audience that was perhaps curious about photography, that understood that contemporary photography was something interesting and something that they wanted to learn more about. I wanted to write a text that was accessible to them, that could present the reasons why each photograph was significant in ways that could be understood. But I also wanted to write to those who were much more informed in a much deeper level, with the possibility that I'm not sure I always succeeded, but with the possibility that I might be able to say something a little bit new about the photograph. Quite a number of the photographers represented in the book's work is very well known. When you think of Robert Mapplethorpe or Cindy Sherman or Nan Golden, there are Annie Leibovitz. The work is known to a pretty broad audience. So the challenge was to possibly say something slightly new about the work or emphasize an aspect of it that had not gotten sufficient attention. So again, three things that I wanted to accomplish in the text, which was very much a challenge, was to introduce the work in terms of its importance, to say something about the photographic medium within each text, and also address what might be some very familiar work in a new way. Let me just let me start thus with someone at random, a woman named Laura Latinsky. And if you don't mind, let me just read what I've written and then I'll fill in the blanks a little bit. They depict fragments of shared meals, the remnants of activity, melon rinds, withered bouquets, squashed and misshapen fruit, abandoned glassware, stems and scattered bread crusts lie on waves of rumpled tablecloth or against the geometry of the table plane, berries huddling on the edge. Laura Latinsky scrutinizes the intimacies of the domestic, probing the familiarities of 19th century genre painting and interrogating romanticism with formal intelligence. Her emotionally complex photographs suggest libidinal rituals and the mapping of longing, fulfillment, and decay in silent repose. The once fulsome is now wan, feverish, becoming remote. Latinsky proposes that the still life is a verb rather than a noun. Nature mort is in her hands a gestural event, evoking absence as much as presence, often resembling landscape photographs in their topography and improvisation in their naturalist lexicon. The photographs articulate the passage of the quotidian to the transcendent. Their rendering of time is complex, the lingering over a meal and the time since then. The softness of light and palette suggesting the passage from evening to dawn, temporality measured from harvest to the ripening, to decay and to rot. All photography has a particular and inevitable relationship to time. Latinsky's work is particularly eloquent. I apologize. It's a very verbose way of talking about this photograph, but I guess that was my duty as a writer was to write something that was informative, but also somewhat poetic. Like a lot of pictures in the beginning of the 21st century, many photographs, first of all, they relate to the genre in which they participate. Obviously, Laura Latinsky's work is part of a very enduring genre of depiction, which is the still life. We're most familiar, for example, with the still life as a 19th century idea. Like most ways of depiction in history, there were particular rules in which one would compose a still life. Many of them had a relationship to economic class. Some of them were allegorical, using glassware and fruit and bottles, etc., to tell a story. But it was all very rigorously structured in terms of its composition. Bringing us up to the present, the photographic still life, I guess, is most often associated with commerce. We routinely think of the photography of objects as something having to do with products and with encouraging us as viewers to buy something. That could be something as simple as just a simple catalog image, something that you would buy online to depict the object with as much clarity as possible, or much neutrality as possible, or let's say an object of luxury, which takes something that's fairly common and turns it into an object of desire. A photograph of a cell phone, which makes it look futuristic and desirous and just something that creates a great deal of need.
May I ask a question here?
Yes, please.
I noticed that I noticed the coloring, how she's used pastel shades and integrated the shades. And I was just wondering if that was obviously she planned it to do it that way. Even with the background, she's used a pastel gray color.
Yeah. I would suggest so. I think it's a very deliberate composition, which is interesting because it feels so ephemeral. Obviously, this feels like something that has been left behind. It feels, like the end of something rather than the beginning of something. I think that part of the pleasure and part of the emotion of her work is the soft palette that you mentioned. There's a softness of light. There's probably also the softness is something that's inherent in the kind of paper that she uses to print. It looks like there is a stain on the tablecloth. It looks very slight. I might also suggest that there's a slight coloration to the light, which is something that photographs very often partake of that we might not be completely conscious of, that light has a particular color to it. I think it's something that's probably most apparent in still life. So to answer your question, and hopefully I'm answering it, I think that it is infused with a very pale color, which is part literal. The stain on the tablecloth, it's part of the softness of the light, and it's a very diffused light. But it might also be, decisions that were made after the photograph was made, which has to do with how the photograph is printed. All of this, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. You know what? You struck up another question. Like how many? Like a really simple question, but intrigues me. How many times would she probably take this exact picture before she obtained what she wanted? Do you think?
It's really hard to say. I mean, that's an interesting question because there's as many different ways of working photographically as there are temperaments. There are some people who are very methodical and reserved, for example. And I think their photographic work shares those qualities. There are other people that are impulsive and are impatient, and they will make one picture. A still life photographer by their nature, I think is more methodical than somebody who makes a photograph on the street and is interested in these random, very quick juxtapositions. So I would think, let me propose this as an answer. I would say that she might have looked longer at this picture than than exposures. To me, there's a sense of contemplation in the photograph. And I also assume that she's using a large format camera. It's not a 35mm camera, it's not an iPhone. So she probably had the camera set up on the tripod. So I would think that she made only a few exposures, but moved things around slightly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And when you said that, it's like, she has the flower, the decaying flower sort of centralized, and then the things work around it.
Yes.
It kind of tells the story of what she's, and then to have the empty tray, and
right.
It tells the story, which I guess is what she wants to do, obviously, by the way she photographs it.
Yeah. I think that to your point, I think most photographers are storytellers. At a certain point in the classroom, for many years, I would ask students, or the question to them in general was always, well, what does your photograph mean? And I think that in retrospect, that's an intimidating question, because sometimes photographs don't mean anything. And I think to ask a 19-year-old to be clear on their meaning is problematic. My point is that I began to, rather than asking what the picture means, I would ask them, what story do you want to tell us? What do you want to share? And again, I think in particular, perhaps one of the reasons I chose this picture seemingly at random is because it does participate in a very long tradition of visual culture, the still life. But I think that it's also an example of how a photograph is not objective, that a photograph can be a vehicle for so much emotion. And oftentimes that emotion is not on the surface, but it's buried somewhere within the photograph. I find this to be a very eloquent and a very romantic, and also a very erotic picture in its own way.
Here's my next question, and it really it's part of this one. But in your opinion, here, and this is a very broad-based question as well, is it easier doing still life rather than actually doing photographs where people are involved?
Well, I'm not sure if it's easier. I think that there's, when it's a still life, there is control. I think that still life photographers are frequently those who are more comfortable being able to take complete control, have complete commitment to everything in the frame. Whereas when you're dealing with people, it's a collaboration between, I mean, if it's a formal portrait, it's a collaboration between the photographer and the person being photographed. Whereas if, let's say, you're on the street and you're making pictures of people, pedestrians at random, you're really vulnerable to whatever is happening at that second. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's a matter of ease, but again, it's a matter of temperament, and it's a matter of an interest in different qualities of the photographic medium. But your questions are terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I know that was a very broad-based question. It's just that some people are more comfortable photographing people or dealing with people rather, and I would think people are very, very hard to do. Like you say, you can still, if you can control, even as an artist, you can control what you want to portray, right? People are very volatile.
Yeah. But again, I think it's really just a matter of sensibility. I'm not sure that it's a choice. I think that like poets and writers and other creative people, there are those who understand the world through objects or want to explore the world through objects, and there are those who are interested in people. I think that curiosity is a very important characteristic of any creative life. And it's also a matter of learning. It's choosing something that you think you can learn from. But having said that, there are people who also really like to challenge their proclivities. And that's another, cliche of photographic education. We're always telling students to get out of their comfort zone, which is a way that photography can assist you. Photography can take you to a place that you're uncomfortable with or fearful of, or being a photographer allows you access to places, but that's a different topic. Let me move on to another picture and see. Oh, here's another one. This is Lee Friedlander, who's very well known in photographic communities and very admired for making enormous bodies of work over the last 50 years. And really changing the way that we think about photographic composition. Let me just read this. I'm going to skip over a couple of the lines. The Opus of Lee Friedlander is of acknowledged significance of the canon of contemporary photography. Inventive, witty, and mischievous, the work reconfigures conventions of composition and achieves order and balance in spaces that are so crammed with information and that often do not seem to merit acknowledgement. Space in Friedlander's work is distorted and delirious, a lattice of foreground and background. The sheer quantity of information is startling. So Lee Friedlander, and it might be useful to say that he's one of those photographers who is not contemplative. He makes pictures very quickly, oftentimes without even looking through the frame. So his way of photography is gestural, it's aggressive. But part of his project over the years, again, is to cram as much information as absolutely possible into the photographic rectangle. Throughout photographic thinking and throughout other forms of representation, painting, for example, again, there are very clear rules about how one composes a photograph. There are good compositions and bad compositions. And one of the things that Friedlander has done is to question all those notions of what is good and polite and refined. And so, again, putting everything into the picture and forcing us to rethink what photographic composition is part of his plan. One could also argue that in the process, he is making a much more realistic, much more accurate representation of what the world looks like. The world is chaotic, even in the landscape, as we'll talk about in a moment. But in particular, as I look out my window here in New York City, the world is chaotic, and visual thinking in its history has said, well, we as painters or as photographers, it is up to us to organize that world in such a way that it feels more rational, it feels more serene, let's say it feels more comfortable. Friedlander is saying, no, it's our responsibility to report on the chaos of the world, and that we have, as viewers and as photographers, have got to reorganize our thinking. So this, for example, is an example of Friedlander's landscape work. And rather than presenting a harmonious landscape, in which, say, the range of mountains is in the center of the frame, there might be a branch coming in at the top of the frame, there's often a strong diagonal. Someone like Ansel Adams, where everything is harmonious, he is presenting the landscape as something that's chaotic, and something that's antagonistic. As I write here, it's not the lush and sentimental landscape, but something that is claustrophobic, that entraps us.
So do you think that's why he did it in black and white then, so that you can't, it's just chaos?
Yeah, that's a really good question. He is a black and white photographer, and he came of age at a time where black and white was the expected palette of high-minded photography. But yes, I think that black and white as a material tends to flatten everything. color helps us to organize where one thing ends and the other begins, or organize things from the foreground to the background, and everything is flattened. Yeah, that's a terrific observation. Thank you for making that. And I think that both of the photographers that we've talked about in the last few minutes have accommodated certain traditions in their work and rejected those traditions. And I think that's one of the ways to understand lots of different kinds of work in contemporary photography, is grappling with the history of particular genres and finding a voice that is more contemporary, which is a mirror of our own experience with what's in front of us. I'm just going to flip through these and see what I can.
Can I ask for one specific one to be?
Yes, please.
So the one that like first really dropped my jaw was Hank Willis Thomas photo.
Let's go to that. I like the idea of one's jaw dropping.
Yeah,
yeah, this is a remarkable picture, is it not?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, let me read, and then we'll take it from there. Hank Willis Thomas, photography and advertising have had a durable arrangement. The photograph is an instrument to imbue the material world with seduction and desire, and to construct an aspirational narrative that promises well-being. Well-being, fulfillment, and social status through consumption. A photograph can transform a modest product into a utopian contract. Stepping away from the text for a moment, this is something that we're all aware of. We're aware of how advertising works. I think we've become we've become a culture that has enormous visual intelligence. We know that an advertising photograph works on our vulnerabilities and our desire, but it's not often that we read the picture to understand how that's done. Anyway, working with both sculpture and photography, Hank Willis Thomas has prodded mainstream advertising from the recent past to divulge racial and cultural stereotypes that reside just below the surface. Let me go on. This is a picture called Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit uses the polished and purposeful language of advertising photography to propose a vivid dialogue between athletic servitude and the history of racial oppression, and the Black male body as the fulcrum between the two. Its title, a reference to the song of mourning and rage, long associated with Billie Holiday, has inspired an image both startling and familiar, adroit in its visual and conceptual braiding. Thomas reminds of the ability of the photograph to communicate complex ideas with brevity and clarity and cunning across language and cultural divisions, and suggests that all images traffic in the marketplace of ideas. Let me put a couple of those things pretty simply. So what we're looking at is a photograph, which I guess it's pretty clearly staged, and it has all the visual language of advertising. It's a studio picture. The lighting is beautiful. Any sort of, obviously this is not on a athletic, on a basketball court. It's in a studio. The picture makes reference to so many different things. It makes reference to the conventions of athletic advertising. You see a Black man who is, in a very familiar way, holding up a basketball, about to put it through what we expect to be a basketball hoop, but which is a lynch. Is that what you call it? A lynch rope. He's wearing fancy athletic shoes. Again, it has all the everything that we expect from an athletic advertisement, but it becomes an equation. It becomes a narrative about racism and the relationship between the hanging black male body from a noose and the black male body putting a basketball through the hoop. It creates an equation which is so startling and yet so, I don't want to say obvious, but so inevitable, that throughout the history and our relationship to the black male, that it would go from lynching to, I use the phrase athletic servitude in my text. Black athlete is still certainly not, oh gosh, it is still an object of obligation, shall we say. Lisa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think when, so for me, I think when you were saying that it's obvious, but yet there's so many layers to it as well, right? There's and I think that your description of that athletic servitude is so apt and fitting. But there's also, there's this relationship to capitalism as well. And, this just really spoke to me. And even just, that positioning, again, there's sort of the way the ball is up in the air in that triumphant, gonna slam dunk, but the head being down.
Right.
Anyways, I personally found this photo to be just such a, and like you said, even with the title, there's just so much to this photo. And it just, I continually went back to it because I was just so taken by it. Where would something like this be shared? Because I imagine, obviously it's a very important piece, but also maybe controversial in a way. Where does an artist, where are they able to show these works?
That's a good question. Hank Willis Thomas has been very successful over the last couple of years. He has regular gallery shows, and his work has become increasingly recognized for its power and its ability to articulate very complex and uncomfortable subjects.
Right.
So, and his work is in many museum collections. He's also done a number of pieces of sculpture, and forgive me, but I can't remember where right now, but there's a major piece that was acquired by some metropolitan, some city in the Eastern United States. If I remember correctly, this photograph, by the way, is also life-size.
Oh, wow.
So it's at least six feet tall. But this is a whole other topic. In the last couple of years, we have seen a shift in contemporary culture and a very painful, to some, reckoning in terms of the history of racism in our past. So I think with that, Hank his work has become increasingly recognized. What impresses me most about it is his ability to, as you articulated, to conflate a number of different things. There's another picture of his that I'll describe that goes with this, and he takes, it's a similar equation. He takes an older Black man who is picking cotton, and he places him on a football field. And so there's the man who's picking cotton, and there's the Black man who is the football referee, the football umpire, I guess he's called, and puts those two together. One of the things that a component of contemporary photography, which I think is important to share, and one of the most evident things that's occurred in the 40 years, 30 years that this book covers, is that the idea of a photograph as a recording of something that actually happened, a photograph as a fact, has given way to the idea of a photograph as a piece of fiction. So as something is constructed, something that is put together, like advertising for the camera, rather than, the record of something that was going to occur anyway. Let me.
I have another one that struck
Yeah.
me. So Mary Ellen Mark.
Yes. Let's go to that work.
So I'll listen to you speak, and then my first thought I'll tell you after.
Oh, okay.
Or unless you want me to sort of pose my question and then maybe the way that you explain it. So, it's
Now, pose the question.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful image, and very telling. But I just wonder, where is the line, and how are artists able to balance that between telling a story and exploitation? Because, this family is experiencing homelessness. It's a difficult situation for them, and it doesn't come across as exploitative, but I think that
Right.
it could have easily done that. Like, how are you able to really take this photo, tell a story where it's art and not just gawking, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, your question is an excellent one, and I'm not sure that there's any one answer to the question, but the question has haunted documentary and conflict photography for 100 years. The photography, the question, the relationship between aestheticizing a subject matter, confronting social and cultural problems and making a beautiful picture is a seeming contradiction, which is problematic. Let me just read the last paragraph here, and we'll come back to your question. Remaining for consideration and debate is whether this transformation of misery into beauty represents a moral contradiction or a form of visual democracy. Is this recognition of high art and visual pleasure amidst squalor redemptive? Or is it an idealistic device and a form of bourgeois reassurance? So again, it's a kind of wordy way of asking what you just asked. And again, I'm not sure that I have any answer to that. I think that there is a general agreement now that making a photograph of social problems is not going to change the social problems. Making horrific photographs in the Ukraine right now, it's important to inform the world of exactly what's going on. But unlike what was thought, say, in the 1930s or 1940s, when perhaps photography had a more idealistic relationship, there's no sense that if you show something, it's going to provoke change. Perhaps the last time that apparently occurred was a well-known photograph during the Vietnam War, which showed a young girl, a naked child running down the road, burning from napalm, which apparently did enormous amount to change public opinion about the war. But there's also, it's commonly thought that our ability to feel something from a photograph, that we as a culture have become completely, it's impossible for us, considering the carnage that we've witnessed photographically. I'm digressing. This is a beautiful picture. And I think one of the answers to your question is I'm not sure that the family, the Dam family, are being exploited so much as their story is being told, and they're being allowed a beauty and a dignity and a sense of careful consideration that we usually give to the bourgeoisie or to celebrities. I think we should also go to the Andre Serrano picture to address this even further. I think it's one thing. Lisa, to photograph a homeless person in a pile of rags on the street, as you walk by
Mhm.
and then move on. It's another thing to, as a photographer, to embed yourself with, for example, an impoverished family
Mhm.
and do a long-term essay in an attempt to show to people that these people that are homeless are, they could be us, and they have the same depth of feeling and the same grace
Mhm.
that we do also. Again, I think that's a legitimate proposition. Um, you know, and I think that what this picture also does, and one could say it romanticizes them, and I couldn't argue with that, but it also gives them a kind of enduring grace and a sense of rest and presence amidst their struggle.
Yeah, I think that for me personally, when I see it, I see a family, I see love, I see that they're going
Yes,
through a difficult time. And I think that, maybe in the hands of not such a brilliant photographer, you would see it wouldn't come across that way, right? That you wouldn't see family,
right.
you would see caricatures of people experiencing homelessness. It wouldn't be that they, like you said, that this gives them a sense of dignity.
Mhm.
Um, that it's just it really struck me as like how was Mary really able to come up with that
Right.
dignity versus that character
Sure.
and mocking stance. And I do think she did brilliantly, and I suppose the maybe romanticized version of it but
Yeah.
yeah, and yes.
Well, again, there's one could say this is romanticizes it, and yes, it does. But if we think about class and we think about, the romanticism is usually something which is afforded to those with a certain kind of entitlement, then they should be entitled to it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And Mary Ellen, to answer your question, the reason that she did this is that she spent a long time with this family and photographed them over a period of time. And
Mhm.
that's one answer to the question: is if you're going to be a photographer whose motivation is to call our attention to injustice and to social problems, then one of the answers is to spend a long time with your subject and understand them, and to show them as individuals as opposed to an idea. And I think, Mary Ellen Mark just has a very poetic nature.
Right. Yeah.
I'd like to bring into the conversation that we're having, I'd like to bring in Andre Serrano.
Right. Yes. Another
And I
one.
think this is also an example, by the way, if one is familiar with Andre Serrano, that you're familiar with with the crucifix dipped into urine, which became such a flashpoint in the night. I guess it was the 1990s, at least in the United States. And let me just read this.
Sure.
Andre Serrano creates stage photographs, still lifes, and portraits that have been notorious in their provocation and their desire to jab, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Throughout the history of visual representation and until recently, the depiction of an individual has been most often as a result of economic privilege and power and social hierarchy. To be portrayed was a trophy of cultural significance and achievement. The disadvantaged have long been a concern of humanitarian photography whose motive was social change, and the impoverished often depicted in squalor as a strategy to reveal what had been hidden or ignored. And that's pretty much what we're just talking about.
Right.
However, in this series, Andre Serrano brought the fundamental tools of the studio portrait, seamless paper, softbox strobe, to photograph the homeless in New York City. He has thus monumentalized them, describing them with tenderness, dignity, and individuality. Serrano uses the visual rhetoric of formal portraiture that gives currency to the prominent to recognize and elevate those without power, thus seizing the language of power to portray the powerless. And I think that this remarkable picture and this remarkable series, to me, embodies so much of what we're talking about in the relationship to how one is photographed and its direct relationship to the amount of power, the amount of economic privilege, and throughout history, the fact that they're being recognized. So this is a homeless woman whose name is Mary, and rather than photographing her in squalor and photographing her in, say, a grainy black and white and with a flash, rather than emphasizing the texture of her impoverishment, he's brought the tools of a studio portrait and given her a dignity and a sense of transcendence. She still is exactly who she is, and she's dressed as she came. But again, there's and her face has such hurt and such has such burden in it. But it's, the broader conversation is about that a photographer has so many different tools, both sort of emotional tools as well as technical tools and tools of framing and tools of history in order to express something about the subject matter. So in this case, Serrano brought the tools of, highbrow studio portraiture, usually, which is, well, until recently was the preserve of politicians and celebrities and royalty.
So I find it interesting that you said that she was photographed in the clothes she came, because the coat, I don't know if it's maybe the way that the lighting is, it reminds me of sort of those photos of aristocracy in furs and things like that. And so it's interesting that she had that, and I don't know if that's what they were trying to convey, but that's what I see. And so a great happenstance, or it was a very intentional way to photograph, like you say, with that dignity, but also to expose the reality of the situation, because it's not that kind of coat, but it's certainly photographed as such.
Right. Well, I think that's a really good point. It's the vocabulary of wealth. It's the vocabulary of something sumptuous. But I think that also goes back to the tools that the photographer has. And we were talking a while back about one of the characteristics of photography is that you can take something fairly mundane and routine and make it look beautiful. And it's all in the tools. So using these particular lights has made it. I would guess that what we're looking at, the lavishness of that garment, I think it's much more lavish than it actually is, and that's because of the light, because the light has imbued it with that.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that he could also 10 minutes later have made another portrait and used a flash and printed it in black and white and maybe a little bit grainy, that would make her look awful.
Yes, and not that juxtaposition kind of photo.
Yeah. But and again, I think that's that's one of the things that we've learned in the last 40 years as a culture and as photography students, that a photograph is interpretive. It is never, a factual record of something. We bring our understanding, we bring a context, we bring, as photographers, we bring our tools into photographic thinking. Any other pictures that I should?
Obviously they were all brilliant. What about Thomas Demand?
Oh, sure. That's a terrific picture. I'm glad you brought, because this might come as a bit of a shock to some of you.
Yeah, because I think that when I first looked at it, I I sort of saw this hope with, and then when I read your description of it,
Yeah,
I had to sort of reevaluate the photo
right.
in a way.
Yeah. Well, that you bring up an interesting point. As I, photographs are, there's a contradiction in photographs because, photographs are so clear on one way, they're so accurate. And the other way they can, but they can also be completely enigmatic. We rely so much on text and context to understand what a photograph is saying. You can take any picture, such as the one that we're looking at, and you can change its meaning by putting a couple of words under it, or by putting it within a particular social context. So this is a work by Thomas Demond, and on its surface, it looks like a fairly prosaic image. It looks pretty familiar. What do we know about this? We know that, or what do we think we know? We know that it's probably springtime because of the profusion of blooms in the background. We know that this is a fairly typical, probably American or Canadian suburban house. We understand that vocabulary. It looks like it's a fairly active place. It looks like there's maybe a home renovation project going on. Perhaps we accept the picture. We don't think here's another thing about photography. I think, when I was growing up, one made a photograph of something spectacular. You made a photograph if it was your birthday party, or there was a parade, or Lyndon Johnson was coming to town. You saved the making of photographs for an occasion. So, but one of the things that I think another theme in contemporary photography is its wanting, or its need, to take things that are not considered to be worthy of consideration, but to make significant photographs of them. So there's a couple of surprises in relationship to this picture, and once again I'll read. I'll skip the first. Celebrated for his photographs that begin as life-size constructions of colored paper and cardboard, Thomas Demond meticulously reconstructs places of civic interest. Beyond their astonishing and obsessive labor and verisimilitude, the work teases a problem. I'm not going to. So the first thing to know about this picture is it's not real. This is a picture which has been created. Everything in this image is cardboard. Everything in this image has been very carefully fabricated by the photographer to resemble something that is familiar. So the steps are made out of cardboard. The wire is made out of cardboard. So on one hand, it approaches a fundamental function of photography is to represent something. So this is a double representation. It's a representation of a representation. We often don't say, well, that's a photograph of a woman in a heavy coat, but she looks so much smaller than people do. We accept the fact that a photograph is just a trace of something. So that's the first surprise. Backyard references a 2013 news photo of Catherine Russell, wife of the bomber Tamarian Tassernoff, fleeing their Cambridge home, not to return. As in all of Demond's work, the figure has been removed. The location's bleak ordinariness and small clutter of the landing, evidence of some small home improvement project, is further stunted by the profusion of pink flowers, et cetera, et cetera. The work is enlivened by contradiction of reconstructing a location of importance, concealing its significance. It is simultaneously an act of salvage and muting, and remarkable for the labor, et cetera, et cetera. So I also mentioned the switchback between fact and fiction. So Thomas Demond has a remarkable body of work of making things that feel really familiar and generic. And there is a sort of, a poignance of making something taking so long to make something so banal. There's something I think that's so poetic about that. And then also taking something which has some cultural significance and removing that significance immediately from the picture. It's an interesting toggle between different desires.
Yeah. I feel like every time I look at it, I see something else as well. And, it's remarkable in that sort of, like you said, it's all a recreation as well with that attention to detail.
Yeah.
You
mentioned something, Lisa, which I want to mention, since I have this lovely podium in which to speak. You said, every time I look at this picture, and I think that's, if anything I can offer this evening, is to encourage everyone to look at pictures for as long as possible with a completely open mind and to learn as much from them as possible. I think that one of the things I've noticed is that looking at art and looking at contemporary photography, which is art, can be intimidating and can cause anxiety sometimes amongst people.
Uh-huh.
If you go to a gallery or museum and you look at a picture, say, of a backyard of it doesn't look like much of anything. I think the immediate response is to reject it and to say, well, that's not art, or that's not worth looking at, or even to feel cheated, to feel like, that you're being fooled. My suggestion is to just stay with it and keep an open heart and an open mind and look at it as long as possible, and to try and learn something from it. And I don't mean to sound condescending or preachy, but from my experience, it's a very worthwhile endeavor, because I think that photographs often know a lot more than we do, and with a little bit of patience, it can add to our knowledge and our understanding. But it's a long-term process. I've looked at certain pictures for years and years, and I also caution my students. One of the things that I'm concerned about with digital photography is that there's a tendency to delete the picture right away. And back in my day, we had contact sheets. And so often I would look through contact sheets and I would see a picture which I rejected very quickly, but then looking at it later and knowing a little bit more about the world and about myself, realizing that it was an interesting picture. And sometimes we reject things very quickly if we don't understand them. Maybe to conclude a little bit, part of my motive is in writing this book is to share the things that I've learned and learned through my students, and to share, the photograph as just a bounty of information and a reflection of the time that we're living in. So.
Yeah, I do think that it is a brilliant book that conveys that.
Thank you.
I also find that, maybe not being in the art world, but my perception of it is that photography has really been accepted as an art for a shorter amount of time.
Yes.
And I do think that this book, it's just a great way to just appreciate it as a form of art in and of itself, photography. Did you find difficulties early on in your career trying to have people accept you as an artist as well as a photographer, or did that come very easy?
I just switched over to my face and I'm shrouded in darkness and it looks really spooky. So 1 minute, I'm going to turn on some lights. Hold on just a second.
Yes.
Okay, much better. That was really frightening, just to see myself
Right,
that way.
right.
Yeah. Let me go back to gallery. Okay. I'm sorry, the question was about photography. Is the acceptance of photography as art? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my answer to that question, and I remember sitting on all sorts of panel discussions back in the 80s and 90s about whether photography is art. And my answer always has been, well, some is and some isn't.
Mhm.
That's one of the great things about photography is that for every photograph, there's a different function. Um, you know, the photograph that we take tonight of what we're having for dinner and we send to our nephew in Wisconsin, that's as important a function of photography as many of the pictures in the book. I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, but I think yes, some photography is art, and some isn't, and let's just leave it that way. I mean, photography is now like language. We all use it. Some of us use it really well. Some of us use it to list what we need at the supermarket, and some of us write poetry, and some do both.
Mhm.
So it's the lingua franca of our time, and that's one of the reasons why it's so thrilling, is that it's there for whatever we want. But institutionally and in terms of the marketplace, it's been completely accepted as art. I mean, there's always going to be photographers that complain that their photographs are not on the are not on the marketplace at the same price point as a painting, but
Right.
so be it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, now I hope that they're aiming for the prices of NFTs.
Oh dear, yes, yeah, yeah.
Because, yes. Well, I do want to thank you very much on behalf of the Pelham, West Lincoln, and Welland Libraries for joining us today and giving us such insight into the world of photography and sharing with us these brilliant images that you've compiled. And again, the book Looking at Photography is available in our link library, so you can borrow it at your leisure as well. And thank you so much for attending today.
May I also add that if you check it out of the library several times and you finally decide that you want your own copy, it's available, of course, on Amazon. However, if anyone out there would like a signed copy, go on the website deardavemagazine.com, deardavemagazine.com, and I'd be happy to send you a signed copy. And I want to thank all of you for this opportunity. I always approach these things thinking, well, what the heck am I going to say for an hour? And then you can't stop me. It's been my great privilege to having spent all of my adult life involved in this terrific medium, and I'm happy to share it. And thank you, Lisa, and thanks Lorraine and Aaron also, and Mary and I love you both. So
Okay, well, thank you.
thanks, Lisa. Bye, everybody.